right, so today I'm going to talk about a martial art that's very personal to me. That martial art is Shotokan karate.
Pow pow, inside fighting, yeah, dangerous martial arts. Pow pow, ooh ah.
All right, so why is Shotokan personal to me? Well, I grew up in a household where my father had been doing Shotokan for a very, very long time. He loved Shotokan and he believed it to be the most deadly martial art. In fact, when I was a kid, he got me this book by Gichin Funakoshi that talked about all the differences between Shotokan and other styles of martial art and how they could break a 2x4 hanging by a string. And my dad would always brag that his teacher could do this and that a boxer could never do this because a boxer uses force. And he would always talk about the physics behind Shotokan and the punching and the velocity and how snapping back, hitting with the smallest point creates more force. And these are all great concepts. As I got older, I got into the combat sports that my dad actually was ragging on, things like boxing, things like Muay Thai, mainly because of Jean-Claude Van Damme in Bloodsport. And I got into Filipino martial arts. And so I just had a different perspective than my father. And I would always rag on him a little bit with Shotokan when he'd stand there and do kata and I'd mimic him. And it was kind of a way for us to mess with each other. And as I got older, I gained an appreciation for karate. And my dad, even in his mid-70s, is one of the toughest guys I know. He out deadlifts me. And he has a very unique view of karate. And now, of Shotokan specifically, and here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that his view of Shotokan is old school Shotokan karate, which you do not see anymore. Now, the reason I'm doing this distinction is because it's very important to this video. There is a difference between Shotokan practiced back in the day, in my dad's time period, when he was in his 20s, which is, I'm guessing, 50 years ago, versus what Shotokan is today, modern day Shotokan. In fact, when my father looks at the competitions today, he does not recognize them. He says, that's not Shotokan. Now, Gichin Funakoshi came into the premise of creating Shotokan with a very unique starting point. He wanted to spread the art as a path to self-betterment. And that starting point created a really big opportunity for Shotokan to become the most popular martial art in the world. What do I mean by that? Literally, there are over 100 million people who train Shotokan karate. There is no martial art that has that many practitioners outside of Shotokan karate. I think the next one down the list is Taekwondo at close to 80 million. But you look at Kyokushin, which I made a video on, that's 10 million. You look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's something like 4 to 5 million. I always thought that number was higher, but that's actually what the number is when I researched it. So most martial arts have around 5 to 10 million people practicing them. Shotokan has 10 times the amount more people. So there is some credit that has to be given to Gichin Funakoshi and his principles because it allowed the martial art to permeate a huge percentage of the world. And when you do that, what you're going to get is a massive pool of people with a spectrum of how the martial art is trained and how effective it is. In other words, the whole McDojo concept is in most danger in a martial art where you have 100 million people training it and teaching it. So you get a huge range in terms of the quality of what Shotokan is. And sometimes people judge it based on this part of the spectrum, and sometimes people judge it based on this part of the spectrum. If I took Lyoto Machida and I said that's what Shotokan karate is, and Shotokan karate is up here. If I took a local school that's teaching, 10-year-old kids after school to be, disciplined and babysit, then it's down here. So you have all the way at the top, someone like Lyoto Machida. You have all the way at the bottom, the local place that's just there to babysit your kids. And so we have to look at the art in a unique way. So let's first go back in time and look at old school Shotokan and why it's different than how it is. Now you look at the old school Shotokan tournaments, the JKA tournaments. The guys who fought in the tournaments were much more grounded. They were much heavier on their feet. They had more, I would say, they had like this hit that was a lot different. They'd sink into their punches and they would grab more. And so it had a completely different look to it. It looked more like fighting, the old school Shotokan tournaments. And it looked heavier and it looked harder. It looked kind of like if you were going to bridge Kyokushin and Shotokan together today. That's what you had in old school JKA tournaments. And my dad used to tell me these stories about how rough the training was, how they would literally have to sit outside their school and the school was shared with other people and people would come outside and walk on their stomachs. And that was like part of the training. And they would just be gritty, hard training back in the day in Shotokan. It had a much rougher philosophy, and I suppose as it became more and more and more popular, it got watered down over the time. And you see this a lot with sports that go into the Olympics and want to get mass appeal. They get watered down, like Taekwondo and all these different systems. And so I believe that Shotokan is a victim of popularity. And so it's a hard martial art to judge because there's some mistakes, or I would say some criticisms I have in terms of how the kumite looks today. And Gichin Funakoshi built Shotokan based on the premise of Kihon, Kata, and Kumite. The 3 Ks, not the KKK, thankfully, but the 3 Ks. So what is Kihon? Kihon is your basics. Kumite is sparring. And Kata is what everyone sees, this kind of stuff. The stuff that I used to make fun of my dad for. I'd be like, that's useless. But you know what? His application of it, he would say, when I don't have someone to train with the same way you go shadow box, I'll go do 2 hours of kata. I get a crazy sweat. I'm crazy focused. And it gives me something to put my mind toward. So if someone were to say, is kata useless? No, I'd say kata has a very important place in training if you use it effectively. I've seen guides train kata and they can see the application in terms of what they're doing. They can see it as takedowns. They could see it as actual blocks for being taken down. And so they're training it, but their mind, and the mind is the most powerful tool in training. You could be, and I've had this, I tore my ACL. Like I said in a past video, I had a very bad period I went through with an autoimmune disease. My mind was always active. My mind was always training. And so Shotokan, in terms of the kata and the approach to it, I could see it being a great martial art from that perspective of keeping your mind active, of being able to focus and understand the movements, again, if you have the right teacher. So let's look at the old style of sparring versus the new style of sparring. Like I said, they used to kind of sit more into their punches. Their chins seemed a little bit lower, and they would step in and they would grab, and there was control after the hit. It wasn't kind of like I hit you and now I'm running away. Modern day tournaments for karate, in terms of everything I've seen, has a couple of things that they do that I feel are a product of the rule set. So the rule set means that you're going to break right after the point is scored. And you're not supposed to make contact. You're not supposed to actually punch through this guy's head. You're supposed to kind of stop short to show you have control. And so that develops a certain kind of fighter. One of the main things I noticed, the 2 main things I noticed that make me criticize Shotokan karate is that guys pull back away from their punches now. Where I didn't see that in the old school tournaments, but I see a lot of guys kind of lean up with their chin, their hands are low, and they go like this. They hit and then they pull away right away. And I mean, maybe that's to not get countered, but if the action wasn't immediately stopped, which is problem number 2, you would get hit. The guy would step in on you, come forward, and probably catch you in the chin. And so the rule set developed kind of this concept of after I score my point, the fight is over. When in reality, the fight is not over. And so you see a lot of fighters that just break. And I think the way you train is the way you're going to fight. I always say this. People are always like, all martial arts are the same, essentially. It just comes down to the practitioner. No, that's not true. That is a myth. The way you train, yes, we all throw punches. Yes, we all throw kicks. Yes, we can all grab the same way. But how I train those punches, how I train those kicks, how I train grabbing you. Do I spar? Do I continue taking you down? Do I punch into the takedown? Do I do all these things? What strength level am I doing this at? How often am I doing it? That training methodology, and every martial art kind of has their own methodology that permeates the martial art, will influence the type of fighter you become. And so Shotokan teaches people to retract and stop after they score the point. And I think that's a very big negative. And so that's my biggest criticism of Shotokan. My biggest criticism of Shotokan is, number 1, that there's 100 million people doing it, so you don't know if you're getting a McDojo or you don't know you're getting the best school in the world. You might be training with Lyoto Machida. You might be training with the corner school, again, who's babysitting your kids. So something else I noticed about a lot of Shotokan guys is their habit to keep their hands very low and their chins very high. And again, I feel like there's a little bit of a philosophical influence into Shotokan that kind of affected the way they spar, as opposed to saying, keep your hands up, chin down, be safe. I think there's almost this need to pull the movements from traditional karate, the kata, the kihon, which is the stance of being hands low here. What you see old school fighting looks like, we're talking about like the traditional aspects of the kata, applied to actual fighting. meaning that if my hand is chambered by my hip, I'm going to punch and rechamber my hand to my hip. And you see a lot of Shotokan guys do that in their kumites, in their JK tournaments or sport karate fighting tournaments. They chamber back here as opposed to right here. And so I think, and I come from this perspective, unless you're an amazing, amazing fighter, your hands better be up protecting your head. I don't care if they're here, I don't care if they're here. I'm not going to go over every single position your hands could be in, but your hands need to be up by your motor. And a lot of Shotokan guys get in the habit of pulling here and relying on footwork, which is great, but again, it doesn't protect your head necessarily every single time. And when you, again, have a rule set that breaks after you score the point, you don't need to worry about it as much. But when you go into a self-defense situation or when you go into a combat sport where you're fighting other guys, it does come into effect. Now, let's look at some of the positives of Shotokan, because I think Shotokan has some amazing positives, especially when you look at some of the better fighters. Now, the most unique thing I think Shotokan will give you, and it's something that Taekwondo will give you in some other styles, but it's not a popular stance in terms of most ways people fight. Like if you were to just watch the UFC, if you were to watch most street fights, is they're very bladed. The body is sideways. They're creating a linear kind of line to you where it's almost like you're looking at half the person. And you're kind of just seeing their shoulder, their hip, and their lead leg. And they're very, very good at using their lead leg and their lead hand to cover a huge amount of distance and punch without telegraphing. One thing I will say about a lot of good karate guys, Shotokan karate guys, and when it's not just Shotokan, this is modern day karate guys, sport karate guys, is the punch just goes with the body. It's here and then it's here, and they've covered a huge amount of distance. And they can cover distance and back out faster than anyone. I always say that wrestlers make amazing strikers because they can cover distance so quickly. Wrestlers are just amazing at covering huge amounts of distance. But a Shotokan guy can do something a wrestler can't. Wrestlers are not good at pulling away after they drive in. It's just the way that you train in wrestling. You're constantly giving forward pressure. In Shotokan, you come in and you're out. And that's an incredible skill set to develop over time, especially in that sideways bladed stance. It's something that Conor McGregor, if you look at, is probably most famous for. In his fight with Eddie Alvarez, you want to see magic? That was being in the Matrix. That is the most beautiful demonstration of kind of the realistic application of Shotokan karate if you wanted to see it. And I don't know if Conor McGregor practices Shotokan karate, but that is in theory what Shotokan karate guys want to fight like. He had his hands pretty low, his chin's high, but his footwork was so perfect coming in and out. His ability to counter and see the punch was so perfect that he just kind of jumps in as Eddie Alvarez punches, and then he's boom, boom, and it's just so beautiful. It is the most beautiful demonstration of striking that I've seen in the UFC, one of the best by far. And so that is the benefit I think that a lot of people would get in Shotokan. And you see guys like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, again, not necessarily a Shotokan guy, but he's a sport karate guy. Same philosophy. He's got that beautiful bladed stance. He's using that side kick perfectly to keep distance. And then he kind of hits you and he backs out, and then he just, circles you as much as he needs. Then when you square off with him, right when you're about to punch him, he's either right out of range and then stepping in and punching you and then back out again. And so if you're going to look at like the application of perfect concepts of Shotokan karate, those are two guys there. Lyoto Machida back in the day is a perfect example of it as well. He would do the exact same thing. He'd kind of wait for you to cover distance, and then you'd step in to hit him. He'd be right out of range, and then he'd counter. And so Shotokan guys are amazing at that. What Shotokan will give you is the ability to measure distance perfectly, because again, that's the entire kumite is based around the fact that I know exactly where you are. I'm going to get there first, and I'm going to just barely touch your face, and then I'm going to be out. And so it really, the downside, the negative, is also an incredible upside in terms of what it gives you as a skill set if you were going to combine it with other martial arts. It gives you that incredible ability to cover gaps in your training, to cover distance, hit, and then back out. I think additionally, it also gives you kata and kihon, the ability to repeat something on your own when you don't have a training partner in a very focused way that keeps your mind active and healthy. And I think long term, there's a lot of, again, I said this about Kyokushin, but I'll say it about Shotokan too. There's a lot of old Shotokan guys, and they're still training, and they still have the ability to move fast, and they still are able to stay with their martial art. I don't see a lot of guys in their 70s and 80s doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I just don't. And, I think that when you're looking at a martial art, if you want to train it, that is something to consider. I'm 40 now, and a lot of the time I think, how much longer do I get to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for? At least at the pace I'm doing it. Am I going to spar when I'm 65 years old? Am I going to go into a gym and keep sparring and then, hurt my body even more and more and more? But in Shotokan, I feel like it gives you an avenue to train that your entire life, and you'll never have to stop. Do I think it is effective for street fighting? Again, when you have 100 million people training the system, you will find some people who teach it in a way that is effective for street fighting. You will find some people who do not. I think that the exceptional people in Shotokan karate are harder to find than the bad people in Shotokan karate, sadly. But they're out there. I do think the system itself, because of that starting point of self-betterment and self-development, does not give it a starting point that benefits someone who wants to learn street fighting. I think you look at sport like martial arts, or you look at combat sports, or you look at systems that are developed exclusively for fighting on the street, their mentality is different than what a lot of Shotokan karate guys have. But that doesn't detract, again, from the benefits I stated. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe. And that's all I got to say about Shotokan.